ready to go? Welcome to the 2020 Deutscher Memorial Lecture. My name is Don Mitchell, Professor of Human Geography at Uppsala University. And it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce this year's speaker, my colleague, Uppsala University Professor of Economic Geography, Brett Christophers. As you are aware, Brett's excellent book, The New Enclosure, The Appropriation of Public Land in Neoliberal Britain, was awarded the 2019 Isaac and Tamara Deutscher Memorial Prize for the book which exemplifies the best and most innovative writing in or about the Marxist tradition. And no wonder. The New Enclosure is a remarkable example of what I like to think of as muckraking scholarship. In the book, Brett digs through the data, much of it quite hard to come by, and shows precisely how British governments have plotted and accomplished a remarkable plundering and privatization of the Commonwealth, often for purely ideological more than economically sound reasons, and frequently highly counterproductive to these same governments' professed policy goals. As all who read Brett's work know, his analyses are always theoretically sophisticated. He is undoubtedly one of the best geographical political economists working today, while at the same time presented with utter clarity. Deeply engaged in key debates within historical materialism and accessible to broad audiences at the same time. His work is impressively wide-ranging, from early studies of the historical and cultural geography of missionary work in British Columbia and the political economy of television and the media more broadly, through major groundbreaking works on banking, finance, and the legal regulation of the global economy, to closely wrought studies of housing and land dynamics, onto empirical examinations of David Harvey's capital switching thesis and Neil Smith's rent gap theory, over to questions of how financiers and financial markets understand and intervene in climate change. And then his Deutscher Prize winning book on land privatization in the United Kingdom. But that is not all. Just this month, Verso will publish something of a sequel, or maybe better, an extension and generalization of a key argument Brett makes in The New Enclosure, namely that Britain's privatization of public lands is a prime example of what he describes quite convincingly as rentier capitalism. His new book, Rentier Capitalism: Who Owns the Economy and Who Pays for It, is destined to make waves. Focused on Britain, the book shows how rentier capitalism has in fact become a dominant mode of accumulation in the global political economy, much to the detriment of most of us who live in its midst. Themes from that book form the basis of this year's Deutscher Memorial Lecture that Brett will offer today, entitled Class, Assets, and Work in Rentier Capitalism. So congratulations and welcome, Brett Christopher.
Thank you, Don. And that's only one of the thank yous I need to do. I also want to thank the people here in Economicum, the building that I work in here in Uppsala, for making sure all the technology works well today. So we have a very small audience live here in the room, but we have people on Zoom and then hopefully people watching further afield at some point for the purposes of the Historical Materialism conference. I obviously also want to thank the organisers of that conference for arranging this lecture. And then last but definitely not least, I want to thank the members of the prize committee for awarding me the prize for the book, for which I'm very, very honoured and grateful. That goes without saying. So Don is right. I'm going to talk today about some work that is coming out of the new book that's coming out on rentier capitalism, and I'll speak a bit more about that in a minute. So it's new work, but it builds upon recent work that I've been doing. So I'm gonna just launch straight into it. So basically the argument of the book is that we live in an age of rentier capitalism. And what I mean by that, I mean, it's actually quite a straightforward argument, I think, in the book. It's nothing particularly theoretically sophisticated about it, is that we live in an age where capitalism is increasingly dominated by rent. And rent, obviously, is it's a word that gets used in lots of different ways by different people. But by rent, I mean income derived from the ownership or control scarce assets. And that means assets other than what we traditionally think of as the means of production, factory facilities, machinery, tools, and so forth. And I think in particular, rentier capitalism, as I understand it, is a form of capitalism that's primarily about having. It's about what you control as much as or more than what you actually do. And as well as being dominated by rent, capitalism is dominated institutionally by rentiers, those whose income is predominantly rent-based. And importantly, especially for the purposes of this talk, that can be individuals or corporations that own those rent-generating assets. I've put on the right side of this slide the dominant types of rent-generating assets that I look at in the book. And they come in 7 categories, and the book, which is a very straightforward one, has a chapter devoted to each of those types of assets and the nature of the economy that is constructed around the ownership, control, and exploitation of those particular types of assets. And so I'll run through them very briefly. Some of them I think will be obvious to everyone listening, and some of them perhaps a little bit less obvious. So the first of them is financial assets. So this is obviously one of the more straightforward types. So financial assets of various types, various shapes and sizes represent the raw material for the generation of financial rents. It can be simple loans, it can be derivatives, it can be mortgage-backed securities, whatever else it is. So financial assets is the first type. The second type is intellectual property. And intellectual property, the main categories of intellectual property are patents, copyright, trademarks, and designs. And so this is assets where the ownership or control of that intellectual property serves as the basis for the generation of rents. The third type of asset and rentierism I look at in the book is natural resource rents, natural resource rentierism. So that's obviously where natural resources, which can be hydrocarbons, it can be other types of minerals, form the basis for rent generation. And obviously that's the type of asset that has become quite closely associated with the terminology of rentier states historically. But obviously it's not just states that generate rents from natural resources. Private companies do too. The fourth type, and a type that's becoming more and more important today, and obviously more and more noticeable to a lot of people, is platform rents, and in particular digital platform rents. So this is where the asset is a platform that enables the owner or controller of that platform to essentially skim off rents by virtue of the fact that they control the space of trade between various types of third party. So that's the fourth type. And so entities like Google, Facebook, eBay, and so on fall squarely in that category. The fifth type, which is, I think, one of the types that might seem a little bit less obvious to a lot of people, is long-term contracts. So this is contracts where companies secure the contract to provide services to third parties for a long period of time, and they have a period of monopoly control over the provision of that service for that long period. And there's lots of companies out there today, particularly in the UK, whose business model has basically become not actually doing any particular type of activity, but rather winning contracts. That's what their business is. And sometimes the fulfilling of those contracts becomes almost a secondary consideration. So, and if you look at the balance sheets of those types of companies, it's those long-term, valuable, long-term contracts that represent their key assets. The penultimate category is infrastructure. And I'm thinking here in particular about the infrastructure for the delivery of core services such as water, telecommunications services, some transportation services, and energy services such as electricity and gas. So control of the infrastructure generates rents for the owners of that infrastructure, which are paid by those who need to access those infrastructures in order to deliver those services. And then last but definitely not least, and this was where Don's point was exactly right, is land and property assets. So land plus the appurtenances on the land, residential property and commercial property in particular. And I think Don's right to say that the new book really is an extension of the new Enclosure book, insofar as what I'm doing is I'm generalizing some of the arguments there about land and rentier capitalism to other types of assets and other types of rentiers. And as Don also hinted at, the argument of the book, while I'm trying to make some generic arguments about contemporary capitalism, it is very much UK focused empirically. And I suppose the argument of the book is that the UK is a kind of a paradigmatic case of contemporary rentier capitalism. And I think there's all sorts of reasons for why the UK has kind of become the apotheosis, really, of contemporary rentier capitalism, to do with some of the policies around property rights and so on that have been very forcefully pursued over the last few decades. So we live in the age of rentier capitalism. That's the basic premise. And really, what you're seeing on the screen now, what you're seeing on the screen now is really as far as we go, as far as I go in this talk from the book itself. So everything henceforth is some of the stuff I've been trying to think about since finishing the book. So there's a growing recognition that this intensification of the rentier character of capitalism requires us, or potentially requires us, to rethink some of our inherited concepts of class and inequality. But in what ways does it do that? So, and what I'm going to do in this talk, as I indicate here, is I'm going to do three quite simple things. So the first of those is to review some of the recent lines of argument that people have been making about class and inequality under rentier capitalism. And I'm going to look in particular at three sets of authors. So the first of those is Thomas Piketty in his the first of his two famous books, Capital in the 21st Century, which was published in 2014 or 13, can't remember which. And then Guy Standing's book, The Corruption of Capitalism, which is about rentierism, which was published in 2016. And then most recently of all, there's a new book called The Asset Economy by Lisa Adkins, Melinda Cooper, and Martin Konings. And so I'm going to look relatively briefly about some of the arguments they make about class and inequality in the contemporary rentierist age. The centre part of the talk is going to be looking at suggesting some alternatives or extensions or perhaps different ways of looking at this than those three provide. And then last of all, I'm going to spend a few minutes thinking about what those alternatives or extensions might mean in terms of implications for Marxist theory, and just some speculative comments around that. So that's what I'm going to be doing in this talk. So, class and inequality, are they about assets, or are they about work, or are they about both? So as I know that many people who will listen to this talk know, traditional theories of class, and I'm thinking about Weberian as much as Marxian theories of class, tend to be strongly employment-based. And maybe one of the most well-known examples of that would be Eric Olin Wright's class typology, where he argued that the primary differentiator in terms of class position was one's relation to the means of production. So either one was an owner or one was a worker. And so capital and labour were the two primary class positions. But what Wright then did was to kind of add granularity to that picture. He said that amongst workers, there are an array of different class positions which relate to one's position in terms of both authority and skill set. So in terms of authority, he said that you could either be a manager or you could be a non-skilled, you could either be a manager or you could be a supervisor, or you could be neither of those. You could be non-management. And then in terms of relation to scarce skills, one could be an expert, one could be skilled or non-skilled. So those two kind of axes of differentiation mean that in Wright's typology, you end up with a kind of a spectrum of class positions where expert managers are the closest to owners in terms of class privilege. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have non-skilled workers that are at the bottom of that class spectrum. But it's fundamentally based around work and the means of production, and employment occupational status. Okay. Now, what those three books and fair to say a whole bunch of other work that's been published in the last few years have done has been essentially to say that, as well as thinking about work and employment and the workplace, we need to think about inequality in terms of asset ownership as well. And so I've lumped them together here, even though they say very different things in many respects. But both Piketty and Standing, the thrust of their argument is that class is ultimately shaped by inequalities of asset ownership and asset-based income, i.e. rent, as well as inequalities of employment income. So they're saying if we want to think about class and inequality today, we need to think about not just where people work and what they earn in the workplace, but we need to think also about what types of assets they own, and any income that they generate from those assets. So in particular, residential property and financial assets like pensions. And so Piketty, for example, one of the concepts that he uses and that a lot of people have picked up on is he talks about these petits rentiers. And what he means by that is individuals or households who, in most cases, work. They have jobs, but as well as working and having jobs, they also, in many cases, have assets that generate various amounts of income for them. And the reason he calls them petits rentiers is they're not like classical rentiers of the Gilded Age, where who essentially don't work in any meaningful shape or form. But rather they generate all of their income from the ownership of, for example, landed estates or whatever it might be. These are very different individuals who, in most cases, do work, but they supplement their employment-based income with asset-based income. So that's Piketty. And then Standing does something a little bit similar, where what he does is he identifies what he sees as 7 different class categories today. And from top to bottom, they are the plutocracy, the elite, the salariat, professions, the proletariat, precariat, and the lumpenprecariat. And those 7 different positions are rooted in, to a large extent, in employment status. But there's also an asset ownership status there as well. So he argues that what differentiates the first 4 of those categories, so the plutocracy through the professions, from the latter 3, the proletariat through the lumpenprecariat, is precisely asset ownership. So the first 4 are all rent-earning workers, and the last 3 are all non-rent earning workers or non-workers. And actually what he points out is that in many cases, though, the latter 3 categories in many cases actually pay rent directly to the first 4. For example, if those first 4 are residential landlords, for example. So that's Standing. And so what Piketty and Standing both do is they say we need to think about asset ownership as well as employment. Lisa Atkins and her co-authors in the most recent of the books they push the argument further, I think, than both Piketty and Standing. They say that Piketty and Standing, and they discuss both of their work, don't go far enough. So what Atkins et al. Say is that, in fact, classes today determine more by inequalities of asset ownership than by one's place in the division of labour. So they're saying it's more important. Not just do we have to look at it as well, but it's more important. And even more than that, they say that so it's not just about being more important, but it's also in terms of how the two are connected. So they say that the asset ownership and employment income tend to be correlated with one another, and that's because they're connected to one another. And they say that in terms of that relationship, asset ownership dominates. So, and this is a quote, they say, positions within the hierarchy of asset ownership overdetermine the wage relationship. So asset ownership determines in many different ways the wage relationship. I don't want to say too much about this argument here, but one thing worth noting is that they have a very, in terms of their understanding of the importance of asset ownership, they have a very strong focus on residential property ownership, especially in major Western urban regions. And Sydney is their case study for their work. So that's that set of arguments. Now, I don't want to get into this in too much detail here, but for my money, I personally think that Atkins and Cooper and Koning's push the argument too far, is my own sense. And I want to talk a little bit on this for the next couple of minutes about why I think that is. So what I have on this slide you're seeing on the screen now on the left-hand side is I have a couple of charts. And let me explain what these charts show. So these are for the UK, which obviously is a very distinctive country. But my guess is that you'd see relatively similar things for other countries. And what it shows is household income in the UK split by type, okay? And so there are 4 different types that are shown here. So there's money from employment, there's cash benefits, there's private pension income, and there's other income, which is the top bar, the purple bar, if you can see that clearly, right, which I hope you can. And that other income is money from investments. So it's from financial assets, excluding pension income, which is shown separately, and it's money from any landlordism that is involved here as well. So this is kind of the heartland of rent, is that purple category. So we have income by type shown for each different income decile. So on the left-hand side, you see the poorest 10% of the population, the bottom decile. And then on the right-hand side, you see the highest income earning decile. And as you can see, for each decile, you can see what the relative makeup is in terms of the types of income. And this was in 2016 to 2017. The top chart shows these numbers in absolute terms. So you can see that for the bottom decile, average income was around £12,000 that year. And for the top decile, it was somewhere between 110 and 120,000 pounds. And then the bottom chart, shows it proportionally. And so you can see as you go from towards the bottom end, cash benefits tends to be the biggest component of income. And then when you get to the top end, you see a very different makeup. And so I guess the reason I feel a bit skeptical about the Adkins et al. Argument is that, as you can see here, even at the very top end of the income spectrum for the UK, rents, as in income from individual asset ownership, is still dwarfed by income from employment, even at the top end of the income spectrum. And actually, I think this is something that Piketty's work really emphasizes quite clearly. And I think he's, based on the analysis that I've done for the UK, I think he's totally right. And I think what this shows, what you're seeing here in the purple parts of the chart, is you're precisely seeing this petit rentier phenomenon that Piketty talks about, which is to say, yes, there are rentiers today, individual and household rentiers that are earning money from the ownership of assets, but they're not earning enough money to be retiring in most cases. In almost all cases, this is income that is a supplement to employment income, and employment income still represents the lion's share of the income for those people. But as Piketty also says, rentierism is now dispersed amongst the population much more widely than it was, say, in the late 19th century. So yes, the numbers go down, but if you go down, you're still seeing a degree of rentier income much lower down the income hierarchy than you were back in the day. So across the spectrum as a whole, rent is clearly dwarfed by employment income, but it's even at the top end of the employment spectrum. So for me, to make the argument that the inequality and class today are more about asset ownership than employment and occupational status, to me pushes it too far. Yes, your house might have gone up a lot in value in recent years or in recent decades, but at the end of the day, you need somewhere to live as well. And so I think that the argument is pushed too far. And I also think that the argument about the idea that asset ownership overdetermines the employment relationship is, to me, still back to front, if anything. So yes, inheriting an expensive home may make it easier to land a well-paying job, but having such a job certainly does increase one's prospects of purchasing such a home. So, to me, if there is a degree of determination going on here, which clearly there is, I think it's much more likely still to be in the other direction. So I think they go too far. But much more importantly than that, and this is where the focus of my talk is going to be today, I think there's an elephant in the room of the analysis in respect of class inequality, not just in the Adkins et al. Work, but also in Piketty and Standing's work, which is to say that they only consider asset ownership by individuals and households, which is to say residential property and financial assets. But the reality, and this was something that became very clear when working on my book, is that most income-generating assets today are not owned by individuals and households. They're owned by companies. So think of things like natural resources, intellectual property, digital platforms, infrastructure, long-term contracts, and so on. But also large swathes of land and property assets and financial assets as well. So almost all commercial property is owned by companies. Also, increasing stocks of residential property are owned by companies. And then, of course, you've got vast volumes of financial assets owned by companies as well. And so for me, thinking about the questions of class and inequality and asset ownership, the question becomes, does corporate ownership and exploitation of income-producing assets shape patterns of class and inequality? And if so, how does it do so? So that's the question that I'm going to try and think about a little bit today. And in doing that, I think what we need to try to do is kind of bring together the worlds of work on the one hand and rent on the other, which isn't necessarily straightforward or an obvious thing to do, because as I'm sure many people know, work on the one hand and rent on the other have usually been conceived completely separately from one another. And that's true for sure in Piketty and Standing's work. And the reason for that, I think, is that we tend to think of wages as earned income, and rent has classically been thought of as unearned income. The rentier does not work. It's the idle rentier is the image that we have. And so bringing them together seems almost kind of wrong-headed in one sense. But the reality is that today's corporate rentiers have huge workforces. And the reason for that, of course, is that assets need to be put to work in most cases in order to generate income. They don't auto-generate income in most cases. So HSBC, one of the world's biggest banks, huge financial rentier, hundreds of thousands of employees, Google, 100,000 employees, and so on. So we need to think about work and rent together to really think about these questions. And so the question that I have and that I'm really focusing on today is to what extent do different types of workers participate in rent earned by companies? And what I'm suggesting, I suppose, is that those different degrees of participation, individual participation in company-earned rents, has or will have a pivotal influence on patterns of class and inequality. So the idea is that one's remuneration, one's class position, it depends not just on whether you own assets yourself, but also the extent to which you as an employee are able to participate in rents earned by the company that employs you. And I want to give an example of what I think this looks like to kind of put flesh on the bones. And the example is the finance sector. So, and hopefully this will show you why what I'm getting at is significant, even if what I say about it isn't significant. So between 1998 and 2008, the UK's top income percentile, so the highest earning 1% of the population, increased its share of national income by 3 percentage points. Don't know what it was from and to, but because I can't remember it, but that's a huge, huge increase. 60% of that entire increase went to finance sector workers. And incidentally, the entire rise occurred in the form of bonuses rather than salary. So this is a pivotal element of the story of rising UK income inequality in recent decades. Finance sector workers earning bigger bonuses. So is that about assets or work? Now, Piketty, Standing, and Adkins et al. Would all say work. This is not about assets owned by those bankers. This is about bankers earning bigger salaries, or in this case, bonuses. But actually, it's clearly about assets and work. It's about both. Because what is finance sector income, if not in significant part, rents on corporate-owned assets? So the UK UK-based banks held £7 trillion worth of assets at the end of 2008. And it was the earning of rents on those assets that essentially constitutes the income of the finance sector. So what I would argue is that those corporate rents are getting passed on disproportionately to top bankers. It's their income is capital income recycled as employment income. These are the companies they work for are earning rents on their assets, and the salaries and bonuses they're getting paid to their employees represent participation in those asset rents. And clearly, we can't understand UK inequality and how it's been changing unless we consider those corporate assets and corporate rentierism. And so what I'm suggesting, or what I'm going to try and get at, is the argument that class is still in large part about the division of labour. But increasingly, the pivotal working relationship is not, the pivotal relationship of workers is not to the means of production, but it's their working relationship to rent-generating assets. So, and to put it more straightforwardly, how valuable is a worker's work on or in relation to the company's income-producing asset considered to be by those who are paying them? Because this will be a key determinant of a worker's wage, class positioning, and their positioning in evolving patterns of inequality. So I guess the premise, the hypothesis, is that in capitalist economies increasingly based on rentierism, like the UK's, but not only the UK's, employees' working relationship to company-owned assets is just as important to their class position as is their status as asset owners or not themselves. And what I want to suggest is that within the rentier economy, there are four main types of work today that tend to generate high pay and class privilege. And I want to just give some examples to put the flesh on the bones of that premise. So the first of those is simply creating assets. You can't earn asset rents, as a company unless you have assets in the first place. To earn those rents, you need to get control of those assets. And not surprisingly, the individuals or groups of individuals at these companies who create the assets on which the companies earn rents are very well remunerated individuals. So let me give some examples. So who's this? This is Bob Dudley. He was the ex-chief executive of BP. And one of his jobs as the chief executive was to acquire the assets that BP depends upon for its income. So he would acquire oil and gas concessions or share or stakes in those concessions. So for example, in 2006, Dudley secured a 10% stake in one of Abu Dhabi's largest onshore oil concessions with a duration of 40 years and valued at more than $2 billion. So he helped to create this asset. He helped put in place the concessionary arrangement whereby BP would generate future rents. A second example, this is Tony Pidgley. He was the ex-chairman of the Berkeley Group, a group that I looked at a lot in the land book, actually. And how does he create assets? Well, he either buys or he is gifted land, as in, for example, 2009, when, very controversially, the Berkeley Group acquired the 34-hectare Woodbury Down site in Hackney from Hackney Council, and would proceed, and Berkeley Group, with its partners, would proceed to redevelop that old council estate in the midst of great controversy in London. But acquiring assets was something that Pidgley did as well. And then just a third example, and I know they are all men, but every time I was looking for the chief executives of rentier institutions, it was men that I found. This is Mel Ewell. He's the ex-chief executive of Amy, one of the UK's biggest outsourcing companies. And he is a rainmaker. He wins outsourcing contracts. And so one example of one of the contracts he secured was in 2015. He acquired a 23-year contract for waste collection, street lighting and road cleaning for Trafford Council in Greater Manchester. So in all three cases, these individuals are people who are creating the assets that sit on these companies' balance sheets. And that promise the generation of future rents. Second key type of work, and I think this is one that's easy to overlook, but I think it's really important, is what I describe as performing asset value. And here I'm minded of something that David Graeber wrote at the very beginning of this year, where one of the things he observed was that the UK tends to have a disproportionately high number of accountants. And I think you can explain that in respect of the fact that for rentier companies, there needs to be a substantiation that their assets have value and will therefore produce future profit. It's crucial for investor confidence that the assets that these companies own are shown to have value and will generate future rental income. That's what investors depend upon in order to have confidence to invest in these companies. And obviously, the place where that asset value is performed is the company balance sheet. The balance sheet is what says, these are the assets that we have, this is how much they're worth, and therefore you should buy shares in our company, because you can see from this performance of asset value that future rents will flow from our ownership of these assets. And so the numbers are probably a bit too small to see here, unfortunately. But what I'm showing here is an excerpt from the 2019 annual report of BHP Billiton, one of the UK's biggest natural resource companies. And these natural resource companies' balance sheets are full of so-called reserve statements, which are statements that provide documentation and analysis of the value of the natural resource reserves that are held and controlled by these companies. And so for BHP, for example, in 2019, it controlled 840 million barrels of oil equivalent. So that's either oil or gas equivalent assets. And it breaks them down by geography, where they're based, and whether they're developed, so already being exploited, or undeveloped, so waiting to be developed. Another performance of asset value, this is from the balance sheet of Barclays Bank. So this is financial assets. And so we can see here that on the left-hand column, that at the end of 2019, Barclays had 1.14 trillion pounds worth of financial assets. These are the assets on which it would be generating future rents in the years ahead. The three biggest subcategories being interest-paying loans, derivatives, and cash. And then a third example is from that of an infrastructure rentier, one of the UK's biggest infrastructure rentiers. This is from the accounts of National Grid. So National Grid owns and controls the main electricity and gas transmission systems in the UK. Excuse me. It gets paid asset rents by the distribution companies that need access to those transmission systems to distribute electricity and gas. And those systems were valued at £41 billion in 2020. They're referred to here as plant and machinery. One other thing worth noticing before I leave this slide on the National Grid balance sheet is the National Grid is also a land rentier as well. It has £3 billion worth of land assets that it was essentially gifted when privatisation took place decades earlier. And so National Grid has a very healthy side business, earning money as a property developer, as well as its core business in electricity and gas rentierism. So assets need to be created. The value that those assets have has to be performed. It has to be repeatedly shown and documented. But obviously, having assets that have a particular value is not enough. Those assets have to be protected while they're under the ownership of rentier companies. And those who perform that job of protecting those assets and the income streams that they generate from commercial impairment of one form or another are, again, incredibly highly valued employees. And this takes us back again, I think, to David Graeber. So it wasn't just accountants that he noticed were overabundant, shall we say, in the UK. It was also lawyers. And that stands to reason. If you are a rentier company whose business is based upon the control of scarce rent-generating assets, having a battery of lawyers to help you defend those assets and their rent-generating capacity from impairment is absolutely crucial. And so a couple of examples of how lawyers do that. The first would be patent lawyers, for example. So patent lawyers help to protect products or processes that are patent protected from competitive infringement. They're the ones that file cases of alleged infringement where competitors are deemed to be infringing upon the territory staked out by those patents. So patent lawyers would be one example. Another example would be contract lawyers, for example. Contract lawyers do an important job for outsourcing companies, amongst others, in protecting long-term assets from, for example, ineligible modification of contract terms would be a good example of that. So protecting assets and their ability to continue to be valuable assets is absolutely key. But it's not just about lawyers. So for my third example, I wanted to give a very, very different type of example. So these are OPEC negotiators. So what do OPEC negotiators do? So those who negotiate production quotas amongst the countries that belong to OPEC, what they're effectively doing is they're protecting their assets from overproduction. They're protecting those reserves from being exploited too quickly and thereby denuding the profits that those member nations and other oil producers are able to generate. But what they're ultimately doing there, if we think in terms of the basics of rentierism, they're helping to maintain asset scarcity by continuing to ensure that overproduction doesn't take place. So they're doing a very different job from what patent lawyers or contract lawyers are doing. But at the end of the day, what they also are doing is protecting assets under the economic lifetime that those assets have. The last type of work that I want to talk about that ensures high remuneration and class privilege within rentier companies is what I refer to as maximizing asset rents. So even if you have assets, you've created them, you've shown that they have value, and you protect them, there's still the possibility that the rents that they generate can come under some form of, say, external pressure. And if there are individuals that can help counter, say, political or regulatory rather than competitive pressure on rent generation and retention, then they also are incredibly highly valued people. And I want to give some examples here to show exactly what I'm getting at. So who's this? This is someone called Tom Bannon. So in 2018, in California, I put this in for Don's sake, in 2018 in California, there were two attempts, one within the legislature and one at the ballot box, to repeal a very important act from, I think it was 1995, called the Costa-Hawkins Act, which is an act that prevents Californian municipalities from using any really meaningful form of rent control. Okay, and so what activists and some policymakers wanted to do was to get rid of Costa-Hawkins, thereby enabling municipalities to enact much more meaningful forms of rent regulation, rent control, because of skyrocketing rents in many parts of California. Tom Bannon was the central voice and kind of coordinator of the anti-Proposition 10 campaign, as it was known. So he was the one that led the campaign against these moves. He wanted to keep Costa-Hawkins in place. What's he doing there? He succeeded. Neither of those attempts was successful. What was he doing? He was enabling property rentiers in California to continue to maximize asset rents. He countered pressures, political or regulatory, to erode the ability to generate maximum rents. Another example, another man, Andrew Whitty. He was the ex-CEO of GlaxoSmithKline in the UK. And GlaxoSmithKline was a key actor in lobbying the UK government to introduce what became known as the patent box scheme. And what the patent box is a scheme whereby UK companies pay a much lower rate of corporation tax if their profits are being earned from products that are patent protected than if not. The idea is that it encourages companies to base their intellectual property generation in the UK, so the UK becomes this kind of hotbed of entrepreneurialism. Whether it does that or not is a moot point, but what it certainly does is that it enables companies like GlaxoSmithKline to generate profits in the UK that on which they pay only, say, 50% as much corporate profit as they would do if the patent box scheme was not in place. So Andrew Whitty has played an important role in enabling not just his company, but intellectual property rentiers more generally in the UK to continue maximising asset rents. Last example. Finally, I found a rentier institution with this person, Ruth Porat, in a very senior position. So she is the CFO of Alphabet, which is the parent company of Google, which everyone will be familiar with. And Alphabet in 2019 famously had an effective tax rate globally of just 13%. And one of the reasons for that is that Google, again, famously has been able to arrange highly favorable tax arrangements with tax authorities around the world, including in the UK. Again, the work on tax regimes by people like the executives at Google has a huge impact on the ability of rentier companies to continue to maximize the rents that they generate from their assets. And so those are four categories of individual that earn very high levels of rents on their that enable their companies to earn these very high levels of rents. Then there's everybody else. Is kind of the next point I would make. So the rest of the workforce, by and large, tends to be oriented towards sweating or servicing the assets, so undertaking the day-to-day, often mundane tasks necessary to ensure that those companies' assets continue to throw off cash. And so some examples of that type of work: the people doing the street sweeping under the 23-year contract that Mel Ewell has won for Amy, for example. The people working in the fields of Malawi harvesting the tobacco that enables the continued production of the cigarettes sold by British American Tobacco under the incredibly lucrative Rothmans, Lucky Strike and Dunhill brands. The people sitting in the call, the hundreds of individuals sitting in the call centres answering calls from customers of banks like Barclays. Or in the last case, the people sitting staring for long hours of the day, doing the job of checking the photos uploaded to social media sites like Facebook. So these people are doing a very different type of job to those at the other end of the income spectrum within those types of rentier companies. And what you find, and this is kind of where I've been going with this, is that you end up with the fact that rentier companies have incredibly pronounced internal inequality, what you might call class inequality, between those at different ends of the income spectrum, between the asset sweaters on the other hand, and the asset creators and protectors and so on the other. So what this chart shows is for 2019, the pay ratios at the 100 biggest companies quoted on the UK Stock Exchange. And that pay ratio is the ratio of CEO pay to median UK employee pay. And what you can see is that for FTSE 100 companies as a whole, the median ratio was only 84, and the mean ratio was 128. But then you have a series of rentier institutions with much higher ratios than that. So Barclays, we've talked about already. RELX is, as many of you will know, is predominantly an academic journals, at least trade journals publisher. Rentokil is another outsourcing company. BP, we all know who BP are. AstraZeneca, the pharmaceuticals company, and then finally Diageo is a drinks manufacturer, where obviously branding is very, very central to their business model. So very high internal class inequality. So what I've been arguing here, and I'll just flick back to what I was arguing, is trying to make this argument that employees' working relationship to company-owned assets is really important to their class status and therefore to overall patterns of inequality. And I've talked about what some of the types of work are that tend to generate privilege within these types of companies, in the same way that, say, Eric Wright tried to talk about the types of relationship to authority or to skill sets that generate class privilege within the classic division of labour. So what might this mean in terms of implications for Marxist theory? So just a few speculative thoughts. So first of all, what did Marx himself say about all these types of work on rent-generating assets? Well, actually not much, except that this was all what he called unproductive labour. So for Marx, only labour power consumed by industrial capitalists in possession of the means of production was considered productive, i.e. it created value and surplus value. But today, especially in rentier economies, such as the UK's, much work, maybe even most work, is about enabling assets to generate rents. That's probably the thing that became clearest to me in doing the work on the land book and then on the broader rent book. Much work is about enabling assets to generate rents. If that's true, is it credible and useful, just as importantly, to continue to conceive of all this work as being unproductive? And I think there's two possible answers to that question. The first will be, well, yes. So, and I've tried to draw this a bit schematically, so we have kind of the UK and the rest of the world here. So those who would say, well, yes, this is all unproductive work, would say, look, you have big workforces around the world outside of the UK working for traditional industrial capitalists, doing work that produces value. That value then gets apportioned between profit of enterprise that is earned by those industrial capitalists who pay wages to the individuals, the workers that are creating that value, but then some of that value is siphoned off in the form of rent to UK-based companies, UK finance companies, UK intellectual property owners, UK natural resource rentiers and so on, who pay wages to the individuals who work for those companies, but who are not generating value. So that will be the first way of looking at it, I think. The second thing will be to say, well, maybe not. Maybe it doesn't still make sense to consider all that work as being unproductive. And I think one reason for that is simply to say that words and labels matter. So, who was Marx calling unproductive in the mid-19th century? Well, by and large, it was the individual landlord. It was the individual moneylender, largely. But who by extension are we or would we be calling unproductive today? All 235,000 HSBC employees, all 100,000 Google employees? I think the point is that rentierism has evolved as a practice. It's been widely corporatized. And so I guess the question I want to ask is there a risk in devaluing, theoretically and conceptually, the working contributions of such large numbers of people, which I think you are doing if you continue to describe that work, to categorize that work and to think of it as being unproductive. And I think there's a really interesting book that Verso are publishing that's coming out soon by the French economist Philippe Ashkenazi, which I'm sorry I've pronounced terribly. And so it's called Share the Wealth. And so he asks, why have working class income stagnated in the West in the way they have in recent decades? So for orthodox economists, the answer tends to be it can only be a function of declining labour productivity. So the argument there is that, well, there's a series of arguments. One is that competition from lower income countries has reduced the value of goods and services produced by Western workers. Another argument is that new technologies have squeezed labour. But what Ashkenazi argues is that back of or behind this kind of material devaluation, i.e. wage devaluation, there lies this deep-seated ideological and conceptual devaluation, where he says wide swathes of work, including what I've described as kind of mundane asset sweating, have been defined precisely as unproductive. And so for him, low wages are partly a manifestation of non-recognition. And so where Ashkenazi ends up in this book is to say that we need a kind of thoroughgoing revaluation of what one might call ordinary work. And so the question I would have in relation to that is, can Marxism positively contribute to such a revaluation while continuing to label all work undertaken for rentier capitalists unproductive? And let's remember that for every £1 million earning HSBC banker, there are dozens of cashiers, tellers, clerks, collection agents, customer services reps, and so on, earning considerably less money. So what might the way forward be? I don't have any answers, but I do have some questions. And the main question I would ask is, is it worth, or do we need to rethink categorical distinctions? The distinction, say, between an industrial capitalist and a rentier. Where does the line between them sit? Between the means of production and rent-generating assets? Between profit of enterprise on the one hand and rents on the other? Might it make more sense to think of rent as a form of profit of enterprise? And then last but not least, between productive and unproductive labour, and I put in brackets again, I know that debate's been had and it's many times, and it's often a very tedious debate, but in a way it's a very difficult one to avoid. So as I said, perhaps a better way to think of rent is not being separate from profit of enterprise, but as being a particular variant thereof. And lastly, to think of class not only in terms of ownership of and working relationship to the means of production, but also, as I've been trying to suggest in this talk, in terms of ownership of other assets, both by individuals and companies, and in terms of working relationships to those other assets. And that's where I'm going to leave it. Thank you.